But he'll leave and she's just sitting on me. She's just kind of like, okay. I don't prefer it. This is what my hair used to look like.
Oh wow.
You put it so the short it looks like.
I can understand.
Yeah, it doesn't needs to go out of this picture.
Yeah, actually does. I wish you would. Okay, so
She's
when
then this is different because I like motivated notes.
I love how I went to dancing and I went to my parents.
So satisfying. This is given like she always just thinks she talks her tongue. I mean, it's okay. It's actually super tiring.
Do you guys try call me like
Probably through her skin. She's got a new baby. And then it's just different after you take a shower. Oh, so how it's like wet. Yeah. She's also kind of I just opened the cover and I was like in there and I'm like, how did you even get here? This is another one of my cats. Her name's Ohio. She's in Orange County. She's actually a baby sister, but she has this mutation that makes her You're now going to be subjected to Emma. Oh, this is my friend and I. My friend was spreading the Bible in our hotel room. And then she's like doing, and then I was doing it with the Book of Mormon, and we were like, and then she was like cross-exing. So that I was spreading the Book of Mormon, and then I ran out of time, and I was like, cut the card at, and then the line that I just read was the Jews. So I was like, cut the card at the Jews, and my friend was like, cut the Jews, because we're Jews.
no, it's not.
Like, literally, you're an anti-Semite.
Hello? Thank you so much for coming from the bottom of my heart. You know, I have to put my sunglasses on because I get a little nervous sometimes. So I recognize some of you because I was walking around campus with a Resist Hate shirt on. My daughter loved it. It's a dog and a cat. They got their arms around like this because, you know, in some ways that's why I'm here. And thank you so much for coming. But first, let me maybe introduce myself so you understand why it's so significant to me that you're here. So like some of you students, I'm actually one of you, a class of 1998. And looking at the crowd, like many of you, I'm an immigrant to this country. And through the generosity of so many people, I've had the opportunity to succeed to live an American dream, starting with my parents who landed in all places, Wapakoneta, Ohio. And your tweet governor, you know, we went to the moon 50 years ago. And so for me, you know, as an immigrant kid, like, of all places in the country, my parents landed was Wapakoneta, Ohio, the birthplace of Neil Armstrong. And then, you know, what I told people was I realized after living in Wapak, and then spending a couple years in Lima, Ohio, and then growing up in Dayton, Ohio, with West Carrollton Pirates and also my favorite Vikings, I want to come talk to you next about the governor. You know, I've lived the American dream, and through my parents' hard work and the generosity of the Dartmouth Financial Aid Office, and also Greg, my new friend, who's in the back of the office, who introduced me to my new friend, John Cameron Turner, who heads forensics. And I met people from back home, Charlotte, who introduced me to Mike Parsons, who's a New Hampshire College Democrats president, and his colleague, Gigi Gunderson, Dartmouth College Democrats. I'm here to tell you as a father and being a private citizen as a volunteer, I'm here because I love this man, John Hickenlooper. No, we're only pulling 1%, but we got a plan. And so this video and this testimony is also for all the people in the community that I'm going to talk to you next. And so with that, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for coming. And this is the man I love, my mayor, also mayor, and Governor John Hickenlooper.
Thank you, Min, and you should also recognize that he is one of the most sophisticated and successful economists in America. He helps run a massive enterprise in Colorado that's not just national but international in scope. And as you can see, he has a heart that is bigger than the great outdoors. I'm going to try and give you as concise an introduction as who I am and why I'm here, and really then open up for questions. So we've got debaters here, we've got young Democrats here, we have concerned citizens. And I never thought I'd get into politics. I never ran for student council or class president. I grew up outside Philadelphia in a pretty challenging life. My mother grew up in the Depression. She sewed all her own clothes. She used to wash the tin foil so she could reuse it. That's how frugal she was from the Depression. She was also widowed twice before she was 40 years old. And she raised 4 kids by herself, and I never heard her once complain, ever. And she would tell us that you cannot control what life throws at you, but you can control whether it makes you better or worse, stronger or weaker. And I think in a powerful way, I think sometimes that life has thrown Donald Trump in our way, and for many of us we couldn't control that, but we can control how we respond, and whether it makes us better or worse, stronger or weaker. I ended up going out to Colorado as a geologist. I thought I'd be a geologist my whole life. There was a recession, our company got sold, everybody's company got sold. There were almost 10,000 geologists lost their jobs. So I lost not just my job, but my profession, right? What I'd studied for. I had a master's. I thought I'd be able to do it my whole life. And I think that was a model for what a lot of people went through in the 80s and the 90s. They lost more than their job. They lost their profession. And we had no system to help them navigate that change. I think it's going to happen again in the future. That many of the young people in this room are going to have to continue learning skills your whole life, because automation and artificial intelligence is going to create just an amazing dislocation in the workplace. I hope, and it's one of my commitments, that I promise to make sure that we provide the skills training throughout your entire lifetime that will allow you to navigate that. I also commit that we will create a healthcare system where healthcare is not just a right but a privilege. I mean, it's not just a privilege but a right. You better watch it. You know, you go on you're out campaigning, and you sometimes you end up in a moment of early, let's call it today, early fatigue. You say things that will get you into a lot of trouble if you're not careful. Healthcare obviously is a right and not a privilege. And more importantly, you should be able to, when you switch jobs, take your healthcare with you. The same thing with your retirement. That we should create a system whereby you are saving for retirement beyond just what you pay into Social Security, and that's portable, because that's what this new level of dislocation is going to take. After I got laid off in Colorado in 1986, with a couple friends, we ended up opening a brew pub, a restaurant that brews its own beer. Back then, no one knew what it was, in a part of Denver that was abandoned warehouses. A place called, we created something called the Wine Coop Brewing Company. The rent was $1 a square foot per year. It took almost 2 years to raise the money. My own mother wouldn't invest. She kept saying, "Who wants to go have dinner in a brewery?" And I said, "No, Mom, it's like a bakery. It's fresh." She wouldn't buy it. But we finally got open, and we ended up opening 15 brew pubs across the Midwest. I created opportunity in many places where there had been no opportunity for a long time. And in that process, we were able to get a sense of what real success looks like for an entrepreneur. And in that sense, we were able to, well, let me put it this way. I learned firsthand that a true entrepreneur defines success not by how often you say you're fired, but how often you say you're hired. And we did that over 1,000 times in those first 15 years. And I took that success and I ran for mayor of Denver in 2003. I'd never run for class president, student officer. It was the first time I ever ran for anything. And no one told me I had a chance. I refused to do a negative ad. I've still never done a negative ad. I wouldn't attack my opponents to pull myself up into TV or get into the newspaper. I also said I was going to run to replace the fundamental nonsense of government with some common sense. And I also said we'd get the region to work together. People said I'd never win. I got 65% of the vote. And I took that. We became the first city, or one of the very first cities in America to have universal pre-K. We did major police reform 10 years before Ferguson to make sure that the police were, that the community had control over how their neighborhoods were policed. After 3 years as mayor, Time Magazine called me one of the top 5 big city mayors in America. It wasn't that I was so good. It was I was taking the system of entrepreneurship and small business ownership into solving the public problems. I call it, we did it from the bottom up. We'd get people together in the same room. We'd get businesses and nonprofits, Republicans and Democrats, to address the big challenges. After 8 years as mayor, I ran for governor, and I became the first Denver mayor in 120 years to get elected governor of Colorado. That's how long-standing the divisions were and the bitter hatred. And I made a commitment that we would raise up the entire state. When I got elected in 2010, Colorado was 40th in job creation. And as we lifted up the entire state, we would not leave behind the rural parts of the state, because I think that's one of the chronic weaknesses that we've endured for the last 30 or 40 years, that the urban success has come without recognition and without participation by the businesses and the economy of the rural parts of our country. And they are an essential part of our future. We should recognize that. So I ran for governor and I won. For the last 3 years, we've been the #1 economy in America. More than that, for the last couple of years, we've been in the top 3 for rural economies. We'll be the first state in America to make sure that we have broadband in every city and town by the end of next year. There's no other state in the country that's been able to do that. We offered tax incentives for small businesses to open offices in rural parts of the state. And that's part of what's kind of driven our renaissance. And we made a special effort to bring together different sides around issues, people that didn't like each other, to begin to address the big problems that Colorado and really the United States faces. So we were able to bring together the environmental community and the oil and gas industry and create the first methane regulations in America. Methane, 25 times worse for climate change than CO2. And the oil and gas industry was venting it, flaring it, no one worried about it. We got them to seal in and restrict and ultimately almost eliminate all the fugitive emissions. And in so doing, they spent $60 million, but it was the equivalent of taking 320,000 cars a year off the road. We did that by getting people to work together. I think that when we go forward and take on Donald Trump, I don't think we can succeed and win in the swing states where he succeeded: Ohio, Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. I think we have to go into those states with a vision of bringing people together and solving these big challenges at the same time that we're creating an economy that pulls our entire country together, rural and urban. People say, well, you're talking about bringing people together, getting this stuff done, of universal health care and controlling the inflation of health care, which we've done in Colorado, I think we can do in the country. They say it's not going to be so easy to bring people together to do this bottom-up economic development in Washington. Well, I would argue that almost every great program that's ever come out of Washington started in a city or a state. And in my 8 years as a mayor and 8 years as a governor, and my 15 years as a small business owner and an entrepreneur, has really made me, has given me the experience to be able to help put together these different programs and create national programs that will actually succeed. And we will be able to bring people together in Washington, despite their most energetic efforts to stay divided, because obviously there's a reason for the last 30 or 40 years Washington's been so divided. There's a benefit to so many of the politicians and the lobbyists there, because when they're fighting with someone, they're staying in the news. So I hope that you will help me in this effort. When people say it's impossible to do it in Washington, I go back to when I first ran for mayor, everyone said I had no chance, no chance. And I carried a little newspaper clipping from the Denver Post about a professor of public speaking talking about the importance of using opposites to create emotional impact. If you talk about the worst of times, you talk about the best of times. If you talk about the agony, you talk about the ecstasy. The words gain emotional impact by their proximity. And she asked her class, what's the opposite of despair? Kid raised her hand, goes, joy. She goes, exactly. You want people to feel despair, use joy in the same sentence. They gain impact by being close together. Then she said, what's the opposite of woe? And a kid way in the back goes, giddy up! and that goes back to my mother. I mean, in most real life cases, the opposite of woe is to giddy up, right? When things are worse is when you have to work the hardest. And my commitment to you is that I will work harder than anyone. I will beat Donald Trump, but more importantly, I will bring together this country, Republicans and Democrats, businesses and nonprofits, and we will tackle the major issues like climate change and the inflation in healthcare, and make sure that we rebuild this country better than it was before Donald Trump. Thank you. I also, in addition, man, I did want to give another shout out to John Cameron Turner. I didn't get introduced. Thank you for helping pull all this together so rapidly. Class of 2003, was that what he said? Yeah. So, questions?
Oh, actually, Governor?
Yes.
Could you give Mr. Turner an opportunity to first introduce the kids?
Of course, by all means, please.
I forgot, I didn't get it
I
right.
didn't get the run of show, so. Sorry about it. Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is John Turner. I've already been generously mentioned a couple times here, and just wanted to give a brief background. We have a number of debaters here who are high school students attending the debate institutes at Dartmouth. It's a 4-week-long program where people do intensive research to prepare for their high school debate policy topics, and it probably not surprise you that the set of students who signs up to do that tends to be a very inquisitive and engaged group. And they leapt at the opportunity to come here and ask a set of questions of an important presidential candidate. It's a program that's been going on since 1985, and it's a real joy to bring this set of students to be able to ask questions of you, Governor. Thank you very much.
Of course. So, and how do I mean, should we pass the microphone to them? What's the best way to do this?
You got a second microphone.
Oh, you got a second microphone. So why don't you provide the microphone to the questioners?
Great.
And I'll try to keep my answers concise so we can get as many questions as possible.
Sounds good to me. Who among our group from DDI would like to ask the first question? Don't be shy.
Come on, step right up. Here we go.
Gosh.
So I have a kind of technical question about what your position on executive power is. So, so Donald Trump has spent a lot of time using executive orders to govern the country. Very recently, the Saudi Arabia arms deal, he's tried to leverage executive power and emergency powers to bypass Congress to sell arms to Saudi Arabia. What would your position be on expanding or restricting executive power?
So, and this is the same attacks that people used against Barack Obama. So, one side or the other is consistently attacking the president for excessive use of executive power. I think the key is to look at why is it that we are so divided. And personally, I'm not, as a mayor and as a governor, I think my experience in executive office, where it's really a different set of experiences. When you're a mayor or a governor, you learn to put together a team and figure out how to get people to work together. How do you create a vision of what the solution for each problem is going to be? And then you motivate your team, you hold them accountable, and you actually deliver results. It's very different than what happens in Washington. Washington, I think sometimes that especially the Republicans in Washington, I don't want to offend anybody in the room, but more and more they've ignored things like climate change and pretended they don't exist. So they stick their hand in the sand. I call them the ostriches. But in a funny way, sometimes the whole political machine in Washington is like a giant whale, and is difficult to move, and there's such massive programs, even some of the things proposed by the Democrats, and have hidden costs and unintended consequences. So I think it's more important that we focus on how do we get people to work together. In terms of your specific question, selling arms to the Saudis, I mean, that is traditionally something that is done through the military branch, and those kinds of sales often have happened independently of our diplomatic efforts. I think it's a legitimate question. Shouldn't that be orchestrated as part of our diplomatic effort, right? Is that part of what you're asking, right? Are you suggesting that Congress actually control who we sell arms to?
No, I was just asking, I guess, would you allow Congress to have any insight in foreign policy? Yeah, sure. Would you allow Congress to have any insight in foreign policy, or would you allow
Sure.
that prerogative to the executive?
So the War Powers Act, obviously, what has happened is we have moved away from Congress having a loud voice in foreign policy. And in that question, I certainly agree. I would argue that probably the most important role the president has is the role as commander-in-chief in charge of the safety and the security, not just of this country, but to a large extent the world. And I would tell you the first thing I wouldn't do is ignore the advice and counsel of the most experienced military and intelligence officers in the world, which is what President Trump has done. I would not empty out the State Department. Someone told me last week that there are over 1,000 desks in the State Department that there's no one working. They haven't hired the people that have left. We've turned in this isolationist way away from engagement with the world, and I think it makes us less safe. The tariff wars that President Trump is using as a tool of his foreign diplomacy, I think I cannot find a single economist, and maybe Min can give me an example, but I'm not aware of any example where there's ever been anything in a tariff war but losers. No one wins. No one comes out better.
No winners.
No winners, thank you. And no one's talking about that. So again, in terms of bringing Congress into diplomacy, part of this is helping decide what is our appropriate trade relationships, right? In other words, Congress has to approve the large treaties. The TPP, the famous Asian multilateral trade agreement that basically many of the Democrats oppose, Republicans oppose, I think it needed some work. But the moment we backed out of that agreement, we gave away all the leverage we had to bring China into the circle of accepted practices in terms of how to behave on the international stage. We knew that China was cheating on their international agreements. We knew that China was stealing intellectual property. And we should have known that a tariff war is a terrible tool to even contemplate using to resolve those problems. What we needed to do, and what we were getting towards doing, was building together an alliance of the world's economic powers and isolating China to the point where they agreed that they would respect intellectual property, they would stop cheating, they would become what my son referred one time as an adult member of the world. I probably shouldn't popularize that, he'll get in trouble with the Chinese government. Anyway, I look at Congress has to be an essential partner in terms of making sure that those trade agreements protect the rights of workers in the United States, that they have humane working conditions in the foreign countries, that we respect intellectual property, that the freedom of capital from all over the world there are no barriers from one country or another. And there's a whole list of things we need to make sure we get right. But ultimately, Congress has to be a part of that. What else? three in a row right here. One,
So-
2, 3.
So I'm from Texas, and we frequently
Ruh-roh.
we frequently experience the environmental impacts of fracking in the oil industry. So I guess my question has two parts. The first is, at this point in the race, what is your position on fracking? And as president, what would you do to prepare our country for the impacts of climate change and our oil policy?
Sure. So, and I'll try to be more concise than I was on the last question. I'm the only candidate, I think, that has a master's in geology, earth and environmental science. I understand that climate change is real. It's happening faster than anyone believed. That the window that we're told, this isn't an exact science, but they say 10 to 12 years before we suffer irreversible damage. Could be sooner, could be a little later. That is in real time of putting worldwide programs in place. That is a blink of an eye. So we have to have absolute urgency in addressing climate change, and that means burning less carbon as an energy, a source of energy. In real time, we've got to go as rapidly as we can to completely renewable energy. It's going to force us to look at things that people like myself, in the 1980s, I marched against nuclear power. There was a thing called the nuclear freeze movement that I was a big supporter of. If you now look at the risk of nuclear fuel, which we don't know exactly how we're going to, store it long term, but that risk, I don't think, is as large as the risk of climate change. And when you sit and look at all the sources of energy that we're going to need, nuclear is going to be probably one of the things we have to consider. We're also going to have to consider carbon capture. We're going to have to look at how do we get away from, in Colorado we're closing 2 coal-fired electrical generation plants and we're replacing them with wind, solar, and batteries. No natural gas. But to close down all the coal plants in China and in other parts of the world, we're probably going to need a significant amount of natural gas for a foreseeable part of the time. So fracking is a tool to get hydrocarbons, basically. And there are places like Pennsylvania and New York where I think it is unsafe for groundwater unless it's done very carefully. There should be consequences. In Colorado, where it's a deeper hole and the groundwater is very shallow, there's probably less risk on that. We make them drill 3 water wells around every oil well and measure those water wells every year after they drill the oil well to make sure there is no water pollution. And we haven't seen it. Doesn't mean there's not risk. The faster we can get to clean energy, the better. But there are also things like, how do we go deal with heavy industry? That we don't have an answer for that yet. We need to start funding research and development and begin to really create innovations faster than anyone's talking about right now to get to where you want to be, which is we don't go past that point of no return. Next question. There's one up here. And we have one in the front row after that.
Okay. Given the recent horrendous events that have happened in Sudan, as president, what would you do to support popular democratic movements in other countries?
Well, that is one of the challenges of any philosophy of foreign diplomacy. And if I was going to have a doctrine, and I'd be the first to say as someone who's, I've gone to, the Aspen Security Group, and I've, taken seminars at the Woodrow Wilson Institute in Washington. I know who the players are. I know basically what the prevailing theories are, but I wouldn't call myself ready to create a doctrine. But if I was, I would create a doctrine of full security and constant engagement. And when you're talking about the economic situations that lead to situations like what we see in Sudan, because it is almost always some sort of economic catastrophe that drives people to those kinds of unthinkable acts. By constant engagement, we begin to look at the root causes of the major migrations that we see in the world. I would argue that even as we, in the United States on our southern border, we go to alleviate the humanitarian crisis on the southern border, we should also go back and begin investing again, which we stopped. We reduced it several years ago, and for the last couple of years, we've eliminated funding to what they call the Northern Triangle, right? Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. We need to put more economic development there to reduce the humanitarian or the economic despair that's driving so many refugees to leave their homes and their countries and take tremendous risks to try and find asylum in the United States. The Sudan is no different in terms of the circumstances. Constant engagement allows us to do a much better job of working with our foreign allies and countries we'd like to become allies with, and making sure that we are providing the resources where they do the most good. And if you think about it, in terms of things like climate change we were just talking about, what we do in the United States is important for creating best practices. But whatever we do here has got to be rolled out in China and India and Indonesia and all across the world. So we need that constant engagement to make sure that everyone is addressing climate change globally. Same thing with cybersecurity, where we don't have any protocols and there's so much risk around cyber attacks. Also around public health pandemics, right? Like Ebola. If we don't have constant engagement, we are at risk that we will not get the information out and make sure that we isolate massive outbreaks of serious pandemics, isolate them before they can spread. So I look at this all kind of tied together, not just in what you see in one isolated incident, has to be addressed by an overall policy.
Thank you. Thanks. So Attorney General Eric Holder suggested adding seats to the Supreme Court to offset the ones that were stolen from President Obama. Court packing, in other words. And you've said that you're against court packing because Republicans could just come back and repack the courts again after they retake power. But Republicans really have already packed the court. They stole a nomination and they put in Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, cementing a 5-4 conservative majority. Now, as a result, states all over the country are proposing and even passing extremely restrictive laws on abortion, punishing doctors that perform the procedure. Do you think that the best strategy in defending Roe versus Wade is to hope that Justice Roberts votes on the side of the liberal justices? Or have these recent attacks on a woman's right to choose caused you to fully consider court packing?
Thank you. It's the last time I invite all these debaters. That's the toughest questions. A couple things, and women's right to control their own bodies, to control their own health care is under constant assault now, like I don't think we ever imagined we'd see. In Colorado, we went in a different direction. We expanded women's rights. We expanded reproductive rights with a foundation grant of I think with about $5.3 million a year for 5 consecutive years. We went to every corner of the state. We used clinics and hospitals, private and public, brought together Republicans and Democrats, but we provided long-acting reversible contraception, so things like Norplants or IUDs, and allowed young women to decide when they wanted to have a family. And we reduced unintended pregnancy by 54%, and we reduced teenage abortion by 64%. And that's a tangent to your question, but I think it's valuable to recognize that there are things we can do all across the country that allow us to make real progress, even as we're debating some of these very serious issues about a woman's inalienable right to control their own bodies. I have said that the one place where I might consider court packing, because I do think it's a pendulum that goes back and forth, and each side adds 2 more justices. But if the basic civil rights of this country seem at risk, I think that might be the one thing that would persuade me to, and perhaps it would be on a temporary basis, but to court pack, to balance back in any objection or objective framework to bring back the appropriate balance in our judicial. So again, if I had ever imagined that we would see this level of assault on a woman's right to control their own body, I just wouldn't have believed it. So that would be the one example where, you know, someone's basic right to marry someone that they're in love with. I mean, love is love. The woman's right to their own body, and you know, all the basic civil rights.
Have you had the opportunity to visit one of the immigrant camps, and what were your impressions?
So they wouldn't let us in, but when we were down to debates in Miami, we went to the immigrant camp at Homestead, and there was a protest there. We saw all the images. We saw people give testimony. Again, if anyone had ever told me, 10 years ago that we would be a country that would sanction government authorities removing children from the arms of their parents and putting them in cages, I just wouldn't have believed it. And yet clearly that's what we see on a daily basis. So the conditions in the camps, it's hard to tell. They wouldn't let us in. They're privately administered. But all the stories you hear is that it's not anything that we would want the United States to be involved with. Again, I think you need to dramatically increase the resources at the border to make sure that there are humanitarian solutions for refugees seeking asylum, and make sure that they don't have to wait 2.5 years to get through the process.
So you mentioned that you support, for instance, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or at least something along those lines.
I support building relationships with foreign governments that are grounded in a fair doctrine.
Yeah. So I guess my question would just be if the U.S. is to sort of take a more involved role in world trade, obviously that has certain impacts on jobs in the United States. What steps do you think would be important to help the people who maybe, even if we're generally being helped by this, the people who are being hurt by certain trade deals and international deals like this?
Again, great question, a question that sadly was not asked back in the 80s and 90s. When I got laid off from my job and was out of work for a couple of years, the federal government gave me a seminar on how to put my resume together and write a job application to try and get another job as a geologist. This was a time when roughly 10,000 geologists lost their jobs. There were no jobs for me to apply to, and yet that was the best the federal government could do. In any trade agreement, there are going to be winners and losers. The harder you work and the more successfully you negotiate, you can diminish the impact on the various industries that are disadvantaged and on the workers in those industries that would be disadvantaged. That said, there's still going to be some losers at some level, and we have, I think, they're winners, and the winners have to help subsidize the retraining, and it's got to be more than just retraining. I believe we have to allow workers to establish just like an IRA, a savings account that would give them work security. So it would allow them to get more training. It would allow them to move to a different community or a different city or a different state if they wanted to. Allow them more freedom when you lose your job and profession, because we're probably going to lose, whatever the trade agreement is, we're going to have some losses there. But we know that just through automation and artificial intelligence, we're going to suffer far more losses, far more dislocation, more industries that are going to disappear. And the only solution to that is to, again, make sure that people are given the opportunity to recreate their future. And that comes from skills training. As I said earlier, we want to make sure that retirement and healthcare can be portable. That should be an overarching goal that we need to establish, because we're going to have more flexibility in how we define and create our careers. So that should all be part of the same system. In other words, these individual freedom accounts.
So China, I think, is becoming increasingly influential in the international sphere, technologically, economically, diplomatically. Trump has, I guess, tried to manage this by pulling out of agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, like you were talking about, and imposing a series of tariffs on the Chinese government. As president, do you think that it would be more, I guess, beneficial for American interests to contain China and prevent a potential challenge to American leadership, or to try to engage with China as they become more prominent on the international sphere?
Again, I think it has to be a combination of the two. You have to have continuous engagement, but you also need that alliance, that framework of other global economic powers to be able to have leverage on China and not let them cheat on their international agreements and not let them extort companies that want to do business in China or actually just out and out steal intellectual property. And that requires, if you recognize and accept that tariff wars are a blunt object and to a large extent useless in achieving those goals, then you recognize that the only alternative there is creating alliances like TPP. And I'm not saying TPP was the be-all, end-all. It needed a lot of work. But creating an alliance, right now, that alliance is we pulled out of it. The other countries that were in it have stayed in it. And now they're all negotiating as a group and dealing with China. And we've left South America, Africa, large parts of Asia for China to, in economic terms, to colonize and build infrastructure and allow their businesses to have a foundation on which to build. We're putting our economy and our future economy at risk by giving them such a large head start.
As governor, you've been quite popular in your state. So why not enter the 2020 Senate race against Senator Gardner and attempt to flip the Senate blue and get rid of Mitch McConnell's monopoly on policymaking?
Right. A fair question. You're not the first person to ask me that question. Partly in life, you've got to do the things that, or at least you're going to be more successful doing things you're naturally inclined towards. What I love most is putting teams together, getting the best people, whether it's after the election's over, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, whether they're from a business background or nonprofits or from an academic background, putting these remarkably diverse teams together and doing the big progressive things that Washington hasn't been able to do. And I think to a certain extent, as a candidate, I'm the one person who's actually done what pretty much everyone else is talking about doing. That makes me feel that I should continue this effort to become the Democratic nomination, to win the Democratic nomination for president, because I think when you think about who is going to be able to beat Donald Trump in Ohio and North Carolina, I think by many evaluations, it's more likely me. We have several great Democrats in Colorado that I think are going to be able to beat Cory Gardner like a drum. Cory Gardner has sided relentlessly with President Trump. President Trump is unpopular in Colorado. I don't think they need me to beat him, to beat Cory Gardner. And I believe that I will do a better job of beating Donald Trump than the other candidates. Now, obviously not everyone, at 1% in the polls, I can't be too confident I'm going to get the nomination. But I do want to make sure that I give it my best effort, right? I don't think a lot of people are paying attention right now to the campaigns. And I just want to make sure my message is out there. If people decide that I'm, not the right person to beat Donald Trump, I accept that.
So I come from Los Angeles, California, and my community at large is affected by ICE. So as president, what would you do to kind of create policies or changes with ICE?
Well, I would certainly never sanction the use of our immigration authorities as a form of terrorism, which is what's happening right now. We need a comprehensive reform of our entire immigration policy, right? We've got to transform and resolve the humanitarian crisis that's at the border today. As I said before, we've got to invest and reduce the driving forces that are pushing refugees seeking asylum from those Northern Triangle countries. But I also think that we need comprehensive reform in this country. I believe we do need a border. We need a secure border. It doesn't mean we need a wall, but we need a border. I think we need an ID system that works. Right now we have, last time I checked, it's I think 7.5 million unfilled jobs and only 6.3 or 6.4 million people looking for work. So we have less people looking for work than we have job openings. So the notion that we're gonna deport 11 million people seems absurd. But if we're gonna deport even a couple million people, we would probably push ourselves into a serious recession. So even as we secure the border and have an ID system that works, I think we need to give every worker who's here without documentation that they should have a 10-year visa to work, and they should be able to get extensions if it takes them, if they need more time to apply for citizenship, or they want to get a certain project done, whatever. We should have real flexibility there, and if they did break the law, there probably should be some penalty. They might have to wait a certain number of years before they can go through the normal process of job or changing their status and trying to become citizens. We also should hold businesses accountable. I mean, people wouldn't be coming into this country if they weren't able to get paid under the table, all over the place. And that's not a system that's going to work, where people are not respecting the law. It's sort of like, we legalized recreational marijuana. That was a law that a large number of people did not pay any attention to. It's not a healthy thing for countries to have laws that nobody obeys. And I think that immigration is another one. Oh, I got so many now. You guys are getting warmed up.
What specific steps will you take to reduce gun violence, and how do you plan to go about that if Congress is still controlled by Republicans in 2020?
It's very frustrating, and certainly Mitch McConnell. I mean, first thing we got to do is win the U.S. Senate, and trust me, I will make. Let me give you a personal guarantee that we will win Colorado. I will, even if I have to crawl on my hands and knees across the state, helping whoever the winner is to win that election. We need to get some resolution to that. In Colorado, we're a purple state, and after we had the shooting in the Aurora movie theater in 2013, after we'd done several months of mourning, we did decide we were going to try and get universal background checks passed in a purple state. Nobody had ever done that. And just like Mitch McConnell, we could not get the NRA to compromise even a little. And at a certain point, when it's important, I think you just have to push it through. You have to get it done any way you can. I came home one day, and my son at that time was 10. He was in 5th grade, and I made the mistake of complaining to him. I'm sure many of you young people had the same experience with your parents. I made the mistake of complaining. He looked at me and goes, "Dad, what do you do at work all day that's so hard? You make decisions?" And I said, "Well, I'll tell you, it's not that easy." He goes, "Dad, get the facts, make a decision, check, next." I said, "Well, I'll tell you, it's not." He goes, "Dad, get the facts, make a decision, check, next. Every day I go to school, I've got to learn something completely new that I didn't know the day before, and if I don't get it perfectly, the next day is misery, because everything's based on the day before." I mean, after 5 minutes I said, "Teddy, you're right, 5th grade is harder than being governor." But I came in to work the next day, and I realized we had the national statistics on background checks, but we hadn't gotten the local Colorado statistics. And it took us 3 or 4 weeks. By that time, the battle had been fought. In the end, we had 2 of our Democratic state senators got recalled because of that battle. And it's funny, the statistics were so powerful when they came back. So Colorado's 5.5 million people, relatively speaking, a small state. And we were getting to 50% of the gun purchases, right? So 50%, roughly half the gun purchases, we did a background check. Here's who we caught. In 2012, just getting to 50% of the gun purchases, 38 people tried to buy a gun who had been found convicted of homicide, right? 38 people convicted of homicide tried to buy a gun. We had 133 people convicted of sexual assault. In all, there were 3,000 people convicted of violent crimes tried to buy a gun, and we stopped them. There were 420 people who had judicial restraining orders not to see their ex-wife or their ex-boss. They tried to buy a gun, and we stopped them. And just in case, the Republicans kept saying crooks aren't stupid. 140 people, when they came to pick up their gun, we arrested them for an outstanding warrant for a violent crime. those are so staggering when they're in your community. And we presented them to the Republicans. Since then, we have never heard a word that any Republican senator in the state of Colorado even considers repealing universal background checks. And I think the first step is we go state to state on some of these swing states and show that we have the will when we get those local statistics. And once we have a little momentum, then we go out and we pass universal background checks on a national basis. And I don't think it's going to be hard to do. I personally also think that we need to go, I mean, we're now having over 6 mass shootings, 4 people get shot, over 6 mass shootings per week in this country. And I think we're at the point now where we have to look at other initiatives. One suggestion I think has real value is that you have to take a class and pass an exam to get a driver's license, to be able to demonstrate you can know how to handle an automobile. Maybe people should have, we have hunter safety programs in many of the hunting states where young people have to take a class and pass an exam to get a hunting license. Maybe just to be able to buy and own weapons, firearms, you should have to take a class and pass an exam to demonstrate you know how to handle and store weapons. I don't think that infringes on anybody's Second Amendment right. It just makes sure that we are not allowing guns in the hands of people that don't know how to handle them, and that in many cases shouldn't have guns in the first place. By that I mean convicted violent criminals.
So a follow-up to that question, I'm from South Florida and my community was affected deeply by the shooting at Stoneman Douglas High School.
Yeah.
I was wondering your opinion on arming teachers in classrooms.
So, I think we were all affected by that. That shooting in some powerful way moved the country. One of it was the students. Their resolve and their energy. When we had the shooting in the Aurora movie theater, where 70 people were shot, 12 of them were killed, and I was the first person on the scene that looked at the video of the crime scene. And I will remember those graphic images for the rest of my life. I think anybody would. I think it's, in a funny way, it's a form of trauma. I think we have to look at every solution we can. I think we're going to end up getting to the point where each school district will be evaluating whether they want to have lockdowns and really control who goes in and out of the schools. And probably it'll be, I don't know, I mean, each school district is going to decide that. I personally think it's a bad idea to arm teachers, just having talked to hundreds and hundreds of teachers. But again, in this country, that's a local school district decision. And states may try to impose it on some school districts in some states. Most states want to make sure that that is a local decision. And every school district I've talked to in Colorado, the teachers don't want that. They view that it's more risk than benefit.
Yeah, so my question's about education policy. And I was wondering, what would you do to close the racial gap in education on a national level?
Sure. And that's a big question after the debate when Senator Harris and Vice President Biden got into it. Certainly the data is pretty clear that people, especially from low income, there's a racial gap, but the gap is almost as large just based on income. And people that come from low income communities, often the parents are working 2 jobs, they don't have a secure household, kids have a hard time keeping up with their homework, there's just so many distractions. I mean, I'm not sure, there's so many different reasons. I think that the key is to make sure that every school should be a good school, and clearly those schools that have a high concentration of students on free and reduced lunch, which is a very accurate indicator of economic background, that they deserve more teachers. I think their teachers in low-income schools should be paid better. Many teachers' unions, not all, but many teachers' unions are resistant to that. But again, we need to keep turning the dial to make sure that someone's zip code is not an indication of how well they're going to do in school. This country is based on equal opportunity, and we're a long way from that. My son switched into, and he's been in public schools all the way through, he switched into a middle school that had been a failing middle school, had been the worst, I think it was one of the worst 5 middle schools in Colorado, a very low income neighborhood. And they turned it into an innovation school, and that allowed them to have a third of the teachers, this is rough numbers, but a third of the teachers came in an hour early and left an hour early, and maybe a quarter of the teachers came in an hour later and left an hour later. So they extended the school day. And basically they had study halls, so the kids got their homework done during the day. That was the idea. And it's amazing, in the space of 3 years, that school went from being one of the very worst to being one of the very best. They also had an inspired principal. They also went to a longer school year. They went from 186 days per year in school to, I think it was 205 days. So, not huge, but almost 10%. And they had to get extra money from the school district for that. But again, our goal should be making sure that even the worst performing schools figure out what is that algorithm that will allow them to deliver the same good outcomes that the best schools deliver. And in many cases, we know the ideas, we just have to find resources, and it's not all that much, having teachers come in a little early and leave a little early, come in a little late, leave a little late, that costs almost nothing. Anyway, I certainly agree on the goal.
Yeah, Hick, it's in times of unexpected crisis or challenge when a leader really shows his or her true colors. Can you share with us an experience as governor or mayor or as an entrepreneur when you had an unexpected, worst day at the office and what you did to rectify it?
Oh my God, where to choose? And I think one example we had in 2013, after we had 2 years of the worst droughts, 2 years of the worst wildfires. I mean, my first 4 years, I went to 34 funerals, right? That was when we had the shootings in the movie theater. I mean, it seemed like, it was almost like, being in the Bible, where, I was waiting for the grasshoppers to descend and the pestilence. The flood came in September of 2013 and basically washed out all the infrastructure in a whole number of the canyons going up into the mountains all the way from Fort Collins down to almost to Denver. And I went and met, so the flooding started on Wednesday, really Thursday, Friday, and then Saturday was the worst day. Sunday, we began to be able to get a look and see how bad the damage was. And my Secretary of Transportation said, well, we think we're going to be able to at least temporarily get all the temporary roads and bridges back in place by the middle of January. And I said, middle of January, with snow, if you don't get it back before winter comes in, I'm sure it'll be spring. And you can't have people separate from their homes and their businesses for such a long period. And we negotiated. I said, let's make the commitment that we're going to do it by Thanksgiving. And they said that's impossible, so we negotiated and they agreed to a compromise of December 1st. I gave him 4 days. Well, I'm the governor. And I told Don, who was the Secretary of Transportation, I said, if it doesn't work, I'll take the blame. In other words, we'll set this goal for your team and your staff, and we're going to move heaven and earth to get everyone back in their homes before December 1st. And it's amazing. So that was a 9-week period. We had one woman who had worked, I think it was 30 years for the Department of Transportation, and she worked between 80 and 90 hours a week for all those weeks. Right? Can you imagine when you're working 90 hours a week, you basically wake up in the morning, you have breakfast, you have a bowl of cereal, take your coffee in the car, and you go to work. And you work all day, you eat a little bite at dinner, and you keep working for a couple hours, and you get home at 9 o'clock, go to bed, and then you get up and do it again 7 days a week for nine weeks. She told me afterward, because we made it, right? We had every one of those towns was connected 2 days early, right? On the 29th of November, she told me it was the greatest professional experience of her life. And she came to me and she said, thank you for asking us to go beyond what anyone thought we could do. And I think that's oftentimes a problem in government, is we're trying to be too reasonable. And when things really matter, we need to get extraordinary deeds from ordinary people. So that's one place where I think that it worked out. I could probably give you a couple of examples where it didn't work out as well.
Besides being white, what is it about you that thinks you can succeed when Obama was not able to, in terms of working across the aisle?
And that's a loaded question the way you asked it, and I'm going to reject the whole premise. I don't think there's anything in my race that is going to, I think the people like Mitch McConnell, who stood in Obama's way, would stand in any Democrat's way who had a progressive vision as President Obama did. I do think my background is different than President Obama's. He's brilliant. He's probably one of the smartest people we've ever had as a president. But I spent all these years in a small business dealing with angry people, many of whom were angry at me because it was my restaurant. You learn all the different tools there are to work with people and to get them feel heard, right? One of the basic rules in restaurants is when someone's really angry, you repeat back to them what they said, the exact words they said, and in hearing their own words, they feel validated. In some way, they feel heard. In many cases, it begins a process where, and it usually takes days. I mean, in a restaurant, it'll take an hour, but sometimes you'll have to call them back again to try and resolve the issue with finality. But when you say the other person's words, you hear it in a different way. And again, I'm not saying this with Mitch McConnell. I think Mitch McConnell, he said he was going to do everything he could to make sure that Barack Obama was not successful in his first term. I don't know, I think that verges on treason. That might be too harsh a word, but he's saying that he wants America to do worse, just for his political purposes. When I got elected mayor, and again, no one thought I had a chance, the mayor of Denver hated the suburban mayors, would not talk to them. The mayor of Aurora, which is the second largest city in the metropolitan Denver, and Denver's 20% of the metropolitan area, so Denver's population is 700,000 people, Metro Denver's 3.2 million. So Denver's pretty small, but it has all the tax base and all the senior water rights. So they just would sneer at the suburbs. When I got elected, I went out to the suburban mayors, and I let them yell at me. And trust me, they hated Denver, and it's no fun to have people yell at you. And you repeat back their words. And then you try to figure out how can you help them in ways that aren't destructive to my self-interest, but how do I help them and demonstrate that I'm going to do everything I can to make them successful as cities. Mm-hmm. And that began a process of almost 2 years where, in the end, all the mayors started working together. And in the beginning, people told me it was absolutely impossible. And again, I'm not saying this would work with Mitch McConnell, because I'm not sure anything would work with Mitch McConnell. I want to be very clear that I'm not naive. But we got the Aurora mayor and every other mayor to unanimously agree to support a tax increase to build fast tracks. It was 122 miles of new light rail track, which was the most ambitious transit initiative in modern American history. And of those 34 mayors, 21 of them were Republicans or very conservative independents. And yet, once we got them all to believe that they were part of something meaningful, they all joined. And think about 21 Republicans supporting a tax increase to build infrastructure. And now, if you fly into Denver, you take the light rail in from the airport, you go right to Union Station, and that was built by the whole region. And they are all proud of it to this day, that no one's turned their back on it. And I think that's a model. Now, is that going to work in everything with the federal government? I don't know, but I think there are a lot of places in the federal government, like controlling the inflation of healthcare, dealing with climate change, that we can pretty quickly and aggressively begin to find common interests and give other people a self-interest to put down their fists and pick up their plow. Okay, a couple of questions more. I see 1 and 2.
So a little bit earlier, we talked about how you were going to work on economic incentives and cooperation with trying to get big countries like China and Russia back to compliance with international norms and agreements and stuff through things like the TPP. External to those economic incentives and programs, what would your presidency do to overcome like historical barriers or like just like decades of tensions that come from like U.S. involvement in areas around China and Russia and our alliances with like certain adversaries of those countries like Ukraine, Taiwan, Japan? Like, what would those programs do to overcome those other barriers to diplomatic engagement?
Well, I'll give you a metaphor or a framework to think about it. At the end of World War II, and I'm not sure we're doing a good enough job to educate our children of what World War II was like. So my mother's first husband died at the end of World War II. But more importantly, every single person in the United States knew multiple people that died in that war. I mean, every town was ravaged by the losses of that war. And everybody, even people who weren't fit to go fight, put their heart and soul because it was our freedom for this country. And my father had, he was legally blind, he has these really thick glasses, he had a bad back, flat feet. I mean, he tried 10 times to get into active duty, and they wouldn't let him recruit. They cut him down every time. He was in Cincinnati, Ohio. His older brother went and fought in Europe. His middle brother went and fought in the Pacific, and he couldn't fight. So he worked at a place called Wright Aeronautical, and he worked for 1,100, I think it was 1,160 consecutive days, 8-hour shifts. So 7 days a week, 3.5 years, as long as they were fighting, he was going to keep working. That was the how passionate people were. And at the end of that war, we created, first was NATO, right? NATO was a strategic alliance to make sure that we never had another world war. And that everything was focused on never allowing this to happen. And in the end, we have probably, I think it's 25 other strategic alliances now with other groups of countries all over the world. And the basic premise of all of them is that we need to keep the world safe, that a worldwide conflagration is just impossible to conceive of if you're realistic. And so what President Trump is doing right now, pushing us to the brink in one crisis after another, is the opposite of what our greatest generation imagined when they created NATO and began this sequence of strategic alliances. Each one of those strategic alliances is based on centuries of how to negotiate. And how do you align your self-interest with other countries? Where can you give? Where do you take? And it takes pre-existing relationships with, if we have an alliance with an enemy of China, we have to recognize what those tensions are. And it's to our self-interest to see if we can mitigate them. And sometimes it's impossible. Sometimes if you go back when President Clinton put his shoulder to the wheel and focused on resolving the issues between in Ireland, and bringing peace to Ireland, everyone said, no, that's been going on for centuries. Those are pre-existing relationships. You can't erase history. Well, you can't erase it, but you can have people absorb it and help change the way they adapt to that history in a way that's peaceful. So I think that's the key is again, it's part of constant engagement. It takes more will, more time, more effort to immerse yourself in the reality of these other countries and help them work out their quarrels, because in a funny way, their quarrels are going to affect us directly or indirectly, whether we like it or not. Is that good enough? But one last question.
We'll take one more, and then we'll recognize the college Democrats here.
Oh, great. So we'll do a question here, and then we'll do the college Democrats. Fair enough? We'll only be a little late. I'll give concise answers. Always concise answers.
So you talked a lot about healthcare being a right, not a privilege. What specific policies would you support in order to make that happen?
So in Colorado, we got to almost universal health care by creating one of the most innovative healthcare exchanges in the country. We expanded Medicaid with the support of the federal government and the federal funding. That's a good start. I think we need a public option. And and I'm a big fan of Senator Sanders. I think he created clarity and brought a lot of these issues to the forefront, both in 2016 and now. But I don't agree with this Medicare for all, that in 4 years we're going to transform our medical, our delivery system. There are some people say as many as 180 million people that have private insurance in this country. And many of them hate their private insurance and would like to get out of it. But of the vast majority kind of like what they have. So in many cases, unions negotiated people's retirement health care, and they gave up their salary to a certain extent to get a more generous healthcare system for their requirement. We don't want to tell them they've got to give up what they negotiated and sacrificed for. So my solution to get to universal health care, it would be to have a public option, and it could be Medicare, maybe Medicare Advantage, which has certain other opportunities like telemedicine. We really want to make sure that we have quality healthcare in rural parts of America. You need telemedicine recognized, and it's got to be part of the what gets compensated. A Medicare or Medicare Advantage, let's call it best practices, public option. If it works, if it's successful, it'll attract those people that can't get private insurance on the exchange or aren't happy with the private insurance they get, and it'll attract them to this public option. And if Senator Sanders is right and Senator Warner is right, then as that public option grows and expands, it'll have more people. It'll come down in cost as it grows, like almost all things when they scale, and it'll improve in quality. And that'll attract more people, and it'll grow more, and the price will come down further, and the quality will continue to improve. Ultimately, maybe in 10 or 15 years, we'd get to a Medicare for all type system, but it would be through evolution and not revolution. And I think that's the key in terms of how you're really going to get it done, is to set in place a system where the Americans get to make the decisions themselves rather than our federal government coming in and telling them what's good for them. And that's what we've done in Colorado is always bottom-up economic development type things, or bottom-up social policy improvements. But when you do it bottom-up, you don't end up quite creating such a massive government intervention, because most people, that's not the solution they choose. Okay.
Has a question, and then Mike say.
The Trump administration's devastating gag rule just went into effect last week, and so I was wondering what your stance is on repealing both the domestic and global gag rules, and how you will ensure access to quality, affordable health care, and particularly reproductive care.
I think the gag rules are another example of President Trump trying to divide us. He knows that that's something that will antagonize so many people that care about everyone's health care, and recognize that in many cases the people that are most needy are those who deny it. So as a president, obviously I would, I would eliminate not just the gag rule, but all those restrictions on people's ability to access health care. I would also work, and again, this is the importance of winning the Senate, I would work towards getting legislation passed that makes those types of executive actions impossible, and sets clear standards by which people are guaranteed access to healthcare, all types of healthcare.
Great. Well, my name is Mike Parsons. I'm the president of the New Hampshire College Democrats. I'm also a rising senior here at Dartmouth College, which is a little scary to think about. But first, I just want to make sure we thank the governor for making Hanover such a big part of his New Hampshire trip this time up. It's really, as I was saying earlier to you, it's incredibly important for presidential candidates to realize the importance of the youth voice in American politics, because For a while, it has been ignored, and especially with the blue wave in 2018, it was built largely, in large part due to youth finally turning out and getting excited about politics in a way that we really haven't seen, especially in 2016, or before, really, since the election of Barack Obama. And so I just really wanted to thank you for coming and talking with young people and involving the College Democrats as well as high schools.
I thank you. All right, you're now free to walk about the campus. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.